HDR scene setup with V-Ray for 3ds Max. Learn how to set up an HDR scene using V-Ray for 3ds Max. Setting up the scene. Set up the scene in real-world units. This is necessary in order to rebuild the real lighting environment. Everything on V-Ray render engine in this guide is using real-world scaling to mimic real-world conditions. Setting up lighting. Doing high dynamic range, HDR, renderings just needs one light source, the HDR file. The light we have to use is the V-Ray Dome light, which guarantees nice lighting, shadows, and caustics. Put a V-Ray Dome light at the world center 0,0,0 to prevent unwanted distortions of your HDRI. Your objects should also be placed at world center, because lighting conditions are recorded from one point, the camera lens. The light setup is not that hard to understand. Leave the multiplier at 1 to rebuild the original lighting. Activate Cast Shadows, default, to get shadows casted from the HDRI. Check Invisible and uncheck Affect Reflections to hide the environment HDRI from being visible to your camera and the reflections on your object, S. This is important because we are using one blurry, downscaled image for lighting the scene and another full resolution image to be reflected in your materials. Why is this necessary? Because doing it that way allows less render times while getting less grainy renderings. The next thing to do is to put the HDRI into our V-Ray Dome light. Check Use Texture and put a V-Ray HDRI map into the provided slot. The resolution should not be set higher than the resolution of the actual HDRI. Our environment HDRIs, *_env.hdr, have a width of 360 pixels, so we put this value into that field. If you are using a hemispherical HDRI from our website, you don't need to check spherical, full dome. However, with spherical HDRIs you should check it to take the full image into account and get lighting from the ground. The target radius and emit radius need some experimentation to get the best quality. The emit radius should cover the rendered scene. Look at the gizmo of the V-Ray Dome light to discover that. Target radius should be about 1/3 of the emit radius to produce nice caustics. Setting up the environment. Set up the V-Ray HDRI map as shown below. It's done easily by dragging the newly created map from the V-Ray Dome light settings onto the material editor and selecting Instance. Select Spherical Environment as your map type for our equirectangular environment maps from www.zwishandiran.com and select Flip horizontally if you want to get an absolutely correct copy of our recorded environment. Because we are using a physical camera to render our scene, we don't need to change the overall multiplier this time. Reflections and background. The next step is to create a new V-Ray DRA map. Drag it onto the environment map slot in the Environment and Effects window of 3D Studio Max. Select Instance. Repeat this step, this time dragging the V-Ray DRA map onto the Reflection/Refraction Environment Override slot. Explanation. Our V-Ray Dome light gives us all the colors and lights from the HDR information saved in the HDRI. It is responsible for the shadows and caustics. Because we don't want the blurry image being reflected in our objects and as our background, we tell our light to be invisible and to not affect reflections. For background we will use our high-resolution HDRI, so we put it into the background slot. We also override the reflections and refractions with this HDRI. We could also put a backplate, from our scene packs, for example, into the background slot. This image does not have to be in high dynamic range, it can be a normal JPG, TGA, PNG, or TIFF. Setting up the camera. To render the scene correctly we need a camera. We will use a V-Ray physical camera that behaves like a real-world camera to do that job. See the camera settings below. For film gate you can choose 36mm for a full sensor camera. Focal length is your choice. In this example, the HDRI test scene, we set f number to 2,8 to get those nice bokeh effects and nice depth of field. Set up shutter speed like you would do it in a real-world environment, matching the light situation of the chosen HDRI file. Most of the time our HDRIs are shot with film speed, ISO, 64, so we select this number. Activate the Blades checkbox and set the number to 5 or 6. Give the bokeh effects some subtle rotation by setting rotation, deg, to 10. Click Depth of Field to activate the depth of field in bokeh effects. Control the grain by increasing the subdiv's value. At the Miscellaneous tab, set the far ENV range to something relatively high. This value has effect on the blurriness of the depth of field. Render the scene. Now it's time to set up all the rest of your render engine and hit render. That's the final step. Visit https://garagefarm.net/n/3dsmax-render-farm today and render your V-Ray for 3ds Max projects with ease. Get $50 trial credits to test the V-Ray for 3ds Max Render Farm service with all features enabled without any commitment.